The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked dirt of Red Ridge Rodeo Arena, turning the air into a shimmering wall of heat that clung to every surface. In the center of that ring stood Dusty, a magnificent chestnut Mustang with a white blaze running down his noble face, muscles taut with exhaustion, coat glistening beneath layers of dust and sweat. And then, without warning, the arena fell completely silent. What happened next would shatter more than just bones. The scent of hay, sweat, and rising tension hung thick in the desert air as hundreds of eyes focused on the center ring. Dusty stood there like a living sculpture, proud, regal, but clearly worn down from whatever trials had come before this moment. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, yet something in his dark eyes still flickered with the wild spirit that no amount of breaking could fully extinguish. Brock Vance emerged from the shadows like a storm cloud given human form. Clad in black leather that seemed to absorb the dying light, he moved with the swagger of a man who'd never paid the true price for anything in his life. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step, and when he reached the Mustang, he didn't hesitate for even a heartbeat. The sound of his heavy boots striking Dusty's ribs echoed across the arena like a gunshot, sharp, brutal, final. The magnificent horse collapsed sideways, his legs folding beneath him as his muzzle sank into the dirt. What escaped from Dusty's throat wasn't a whinny or a cry of pain. It was something deeper, more haunting, a sound that could only be described as heartbreak made audible. Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves. Old cowboys gripped the arena rails until their knuckles turned white. Others turned their faces away, unable to witness what they'd just seen. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the rodeo hands stood frozen, caught between duty and an instinctive revulsion that left them paralyzed. Brock glanced around the stunned crowd, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was almost daring someone, anyone, to say something, to challenge him. All he saw was a sea of shocked silence. Faces turned away in shame and fear. He thought he was untouchable, invisible, just another drifter passing through a town too small to remember his name. But what Brock didn't see was the man standing at the far end of the arena. Ely Mercer leaned against the weathered fence, his form carved from years of desert wind, profound grief and unshakable grit. He wore a sun-faded hat and denim that had seen decades of honest work. But it was his eyes, steel gray and unwavering, that made him different from every other person in that crowd. Those eyes were locked on the Mustang lying in the dirt, on his Mustang. Ely didn't shout. He didn't move a muscle. He simply watched with the terrible patience of a man who understood that some moments change everything, and that rushing toward justice often means missing it entirely. Because Dusty wasn't just a horse to Ely Mercer. He was the last living connection to his beloved wife, her final gift before the cancer claimed her gentle soul. That animal represented family, memory, and all the love that still lived in Ela's weathered heart. And Brock Vance had just kicked family. Something ancient stirred deep in Ela's chest. Not rage, not yet. Something older and more dangerous. The kind of pain that simmers in complete silence, gathering strength, waiting for exactly the right moment to rise and reclaim what was stolen. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, each person carrying their shame like a stone in their chest, Ely remained exactly where he was, unblinking, unmoved, waiting. Because true justice doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes quiet as dust and memory, carried in the steady heartbeat of a man who knows the difference between revenge and reckoning. If Dusty's pain moved you, hit like and subscribe. This story needs to be seen. Comment, "I saw what he did," to show you were watching when no one else dared to speak. Let's give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. The roar of Brock's Harley shattered the Texas dusk like a warning shot as he tore down the dirt road, dust swirling behind him like angry spirits demanding answers he'd never give. To everyone who watched him disappear into the fading light, Brock Vance was exactly what he appeared to be, a drifter, a man who materialized from nowhere and claimed whatever space his fists could carve out. But behind the tattoos and black leather lived a story no one in this town knew. Behind the rage that powered his boots and the emptiness that drove his wheels was a man carrying more than just attitude. There was a reason for the fire in his eyes, the weight behind every blow he delivered. It didn't excuse what he'd done to Dusty, nothing could. But it hinted at flames that hadn't always been his fault. He pulled into the shadowed back lot of Murphy's old mechanic shop, killing the engine with a violent twist of his wrist. A young man emerged from the garage, thin, pale, barely 20, with eyes that flinched like a beaten dog expecting another slap. Brock said nothing as he tossed a crumpled bag of fast food toward the kid and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled, though he'd died before admitting it. The silence between them was as familiar as breathing. Brock didn't do feelings or explanations. Only bruises or silence. Yet there were nights when this boy heard Brock mumble names in his sleep. Names that didn't belong to anyone in this forgotten town. Names that carried the weight of ghosts. Back at the arena, Eli remained long after the last truck had rumbled away into the darkness. Dusty stood now, though his powerful body still trembled like leaves in a storm. The Mustang's eyes found Eli's through the fence, not seeking pity, but offering something that cut deeper than any physical wound, an apology for existing in a world where such cruelty was possible. Eli placed his weathered hand on the wooden rail, knuckles pale with the effort of holding back decades of carefully controlled emotion. "Not your fault, boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "None of this is your fault." That moment of connection, horse to man, survivor to protector, sliced through Eli's chest like a blade made of memory. Dusty had been with him through the absolute worst of it. When the house grew tomb quiet after his wife's final breath, it was Dusty's warm presence in the barn that kept Eli tethered to the living world. Now someone had dared to violate that sacred peace. Eli wasn't a violent man by nature, but he wasn't passive either. He came from a generation that believed in accountability, not vengeance, but reckoning. The kind that arrives quiet as morning frost, and twice as inevitable. And in Brock Vance, despite the rage and the cruelty, Eli glimpsed something unnervingly familiar. A man cracked wide open by invisible forces, bleeding in ways that made him dangerous to everything around him. But recognition didn't erase the line that had been crossed in that arena. Some boundaries, once shattered, demand rebuilding, no matter the cost. Deep in his weathered bones, Eli understood this wouldn't end with a simple confrontation. This would be a process, slow, deliberate, like watching storm clouds gather on a clear horizon. He walked Dusty back toward the stable, each footstep echoing in the growing darkness like a drumbeat counting down to something neither man could yet imagine. He didn't speak much during that walk. Words felt small and insufficient. Dusty limped beside him, head lowered but spirit unbroken. For now, that fragile resilience was enough. But the silence between horse and man wasn't empty. It pulsed with something ancient and patient, something that knew how to wait for exactly the right moment to emerge. Somewhere out there in the desert night, Brock Vance had no idea he'd just declared war on a man who understood that the most dangerous battles are fought not with fists, but with time, truth, and the quiet determination of someone who's already lost everything that mattered and refuses to lose anything more. Brock sat alone in the suffocating back room of the garage that night, the bare bulb above him flickering like it couldn't decide whether to keep fighting the darkness. His beer had gone warm hours ago, but his mind burned hotter with each passing minute. The image of that damn horse collapsing played on endless repeat behind his closed eyelids, though he'd rather face a loaded gun than admit it. He kept telling himself it didn't matter. Just a horse, just another stupid animal that got in his way. But something about the way Dusty had looked up at him in that final moment before impact, not with fear but with a kind of shocked disappointment, had crawled under his skin and made itself at home, festering like an infection he couldn't name. On the cracked wall above his makeshift cot hung a photograph so sun-bleached and crooked, it looked like a relic from another lifetime. A younger Brock, maybe 20, stood beside a little boy no older than 6. Both wore the same lopsided smile, the kind that doesn't spring from joy, but from desperate pretending, from learning too young that happiness is something you perform rather than feel. The boy had been his brother. Had been. Brock hadn't seen him in over a decade. Not since the fire consumed everything they'd built together. Not since the night when running became easier than staying to face the ashes of their shared dreams. It was safer to live untethered like this, he told himself. No roots meant no one could rip them out. No past meant no ghosts demanding explanations. But pain doesn't honor those rules. It has a way of catching up, of finding you even in the middle of nowhere, especially when you think you've finally outrun it. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, Eli stood motionless on his porch, beneath a canopy of stars so sharp and bright, they seemed to be sitting in judgment of everything happening below. He held a cup of coffee that had long since turned bitter and cold, but he barely noticed. The conversation he needed to have was taking shape in his mind, word by careful word. He hadn't told anyone what he'd witnessed at the arena. Not yet. He knew this town, understood its rhythms and fears. Folks wanted peace, or at least the comfortable illusion of it. But illusions don't heal bruised ribs or mend broken trust. And Dusty's wounds ran deeper than the physical damage anyone could see. Inside the barn, Dusty lay curled in his stall, eyes half closed but alert. Eli settled beside him, cross-legged on the sweet-smelling hay, just like he used to do with his wife during their younger years when the world felt infinite and forgiving. He didn't know what he was doing, Eli whispered into the darkness, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was talking about Brock or trying to convince himself. But that doesn't mean he won't do it again. His weathered hand found Dusty's mane, and the Mustang exhaled in a long, slow sigh, the kind only a creature who remembers safety can make. In that breath, Eli heard echoes of every quiet evening he'd spent with his wife. Every moment of peace they'd carved out together before cancer stole her away piece by piece. Somewhere deep in his chest, Eli recognized that this confrontation was about more than protecting Dusty. It was about every buried anger, every swallowed word, every time he'd chosen silence over action in the name of being the good man, the peaceful man. Brock had struck a match and thrown it into the dry kindling of 20 years' worth of suppressed fire. The next morning arrived gray and hesitant, as if even the sun wasn't sure it wanted to witness what was coming. Eli drove into town with purpose burning in his chest, not for groceries or supplies, but for the answers that had been eluding him since that first terrible moment in the arena. Sheriff Milan was an old friend, the kind who understood that some questions carried more weight than others. When Eli mentioned Brock Vance's name, the sheriff's expression shifted like clouds covering the sun. "Trouble, that one," Milan muttered, leaning back in his chair with the weariness of a man who'd seen too many damaged souls pass through his small corner of the world. Came up from El Paso, said he was just drifting through. Been squatting behind Murphy's garage, keeps to himself mostly. The intake form revealed what Eli's heart had somehow already known. Mother's name, Rachel Vance. The air left his lungs in a rush. Rachel, the quiet, gentle girl who'd worked his ranch 20 years ago when his wife was still alive. The one who'd left town suddenly, unexpectedly pregnant, carrying secrets none of them had thought to ask about. He remembered his wife's concern. How she'd packed Rachel a bag and left money on the bunkhouse nightstand. How they'd both wondered what became of her after she vanished into a world that didn't seem big enough to hide in. Now he knew. She'd hidden in plain sight, in the spaces between one broken day and the next, raising a son who'd inherited her pain along with her name. Brock wasn't just some random drifter who'd wandered into their lives. He was the living consequence of choices made decades ago, of kindnesses offered and connections lost, of all the ways good intentions can echo through time and return transformed into something unrecognizable. Standing there in the sheriff's office with that faded document in his hands, Eli felt the full weight of unintended consequences settling on his shoulders like snow. The man who'd hurt his horse wasn't a stranger at all. He was family, twisted by circumstances. Eli had played a part in creating damage by silences. Eli had helped maintain. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should Eli reveal the truth about Rachel, or are some secrets too dangerous to unearth? Your voice matters, and it just might change how this story ends. The desert wind carried more than dust that night. It carried the weight of 20 years' worth of unspoken truths, pulling Brock's boots down a path he never intended to walk. His Harley sat silent behind him, as he found himself standing at the edge of Mercer Ranch, moonlight casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts that seemed to whisper stories he wasn't ready to hear. He hadn't planned to come here. His feet had simply started moving. Like some invisible thread was reeling him in toward a confrontation he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground was resisting his presence, warning him that some boundaries once crossed change everything. Eli had been expecting him. Not because of any mystical intuition, but because broken men follow predictable patterns when the walls they've built around themselves finally start to crumble. He stood by the barn door, arms crossed, backlit by the warm glow spilling from inside where Dusty rested, alert but peaceful, healing in the way that only happens when safety becomes more than just a word. The two men faced each other across 10 feet of desert air thick with everything they hadn't said yet. No crowd this time, no audience to perform for or hide behind. Just truth waiting patiently in the space between them. "I don't know why I'm here," Brock muttered, his voice carrying the brittle edge of a man trying to convince himself he was still in control. "I don't owe you anything." Eli's response came soft as midnight rain. "You don't, but maybe you owe yourself something." The words hit Brock like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they carried the weight of recognition, as if this stranger somehow saw straight through the armor he'd spent decades forging. From his jacket, Eli withdrew something that made the desert air itself seem to hold its breath. A photograph, creased and faded but unmistakable. A little boy with sun-bleached hair and a crooked smile, feeding a chestnut foal with a distinctive white blaze down its face. "Is this you?" Eli asked, his voice gentle as a prayer. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Brock Vance had no answer. The photograph trembled in his hands like a living thing as memories he'd buried came flooding back, the warmth of that foal's breath against his small chest, his mother's laugh echoing across a ranch that had felt like the entire world, the way safety had tasted before he learned that everything good eventually gets taken away. Eli watched the wall around Brock's heart develop its first crack, not a shattering, just a hairline fracture where light could finally get in. "Your mother worked here," he said quietly. "Rachel. She was kind, gentle. My wife adored her." His voice grew heavy with the weight of old regrets. "When she left, she didn't say why, but we knew something was wrong. We should have done more, should have gone after her." The confession hung between them like smoke from an extinguished fire. Brock's throat tightened as pieces of his life's puzzle finally clicked into place. All those years of resenting shadows, of hating men who weren't there, of carrying rage like a shield against abandonment. And here stood one of those shadows, looking nothing like the monster he'd imagined. Just a tired old man with pain in his eyes and calluses on his hands from a lifetime of honest work. "I didn't know about you," Eli continued, each word careful as a surgeon's blade. "Not until I saw your name on that paper. And when I saw what you did to Dusty." He paused, breathing in the desert night. "I wanted to hate you, God knows I tried. But something told me that wasn't the end of the story." Brock turned toward the barn, where Dusty stood watching them with liquid brown eyes that held no trace of fear anymore. Only the patient wisdom of a creature who understands that healing happens one heartbeat at a time. The sight of that noble head, that white blaze he remembered from dreams he'd forgotten he'd had, broke something loose inside his chest. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," he finally whispered. The words torn from some deep place he'd kept locked for 20 years. Eli nodded slowly, understanding flooding his weathered features. "Neither do I, but maybe you start by not running this time." The morning came wrapped in golden light that seemed to bless everything it touched. Eli found Brock exactly where he'd left him, curled beside his motorcycle near the fence, jacket pulled tight against the desert cold. He hadn't fled in the darkness. For a man whose entire life had been built on disappearing, that choice to stay felt like the first real victory either of them had won. Without words, they walked together toward the barn where Dusty waited. The Mustang stepped forward slowly, deliberately, and extended his muzzle toward Brock's trembling hand. When horse and man touched, gentle as a whisper, profound as forgiveness, something fundamental shifted in the universe. Brock's shoulders dropped, his eyes turned glassy. For the first time in decades, he didn't fight the feeling rising in his chest. He let it come, the guilt, the sorrow, the overwhelming relief of finally being seen by someone who understood that broken doesn't always mean beyond repair. "My mom used to tell me about this place," Brock said, his voice rough as sandpaper but steady. "Said it was the only place she ever felt truly safe. I always thought she left because of me, like I wasn't enough." He looked out across the ranch that had haunted his dreams. "Turns out she was running from everything, trying to protect me from it too." Eli placed a weathered hand on Brock's shoulder, the first gentle touch the younger man could remember receiving in years. "She wasn't weak, son. She was scared, and she did what she thought was right. But she wasn't alone in her mistakes. We should have done better by her. I should have done better." There it was, the shared burden that had been dividing them, finally acknowledged and accepted by both men. 2 generations, both carrying pieces of the same broken past, finally admitting they didn't have to bear that weight in isolation. The days that followed moved with the patient rhythm of healing. Brock stayed on the ranch, not as a guest or charity case, but as something entirely new. A man learning what it meant to belong somewhere. He worked without being asked, feeding animals, mending fences, repairing the broken barn door hinge that Eli had ignored for months. Most importantly, he spent hours with Dusty, rebuilding trust one gentle touch at a time. The Mustang seemed to understand that forgiveness is a choice made fresh each morning, that healing happens not in grand gestures, but in the quiet accumulation of kind moments. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of hope, both men sat on the porch watching Dusty graze in the pasture, his coat gleaming like burnished copper in the golden light. "He's stronger now," Brock observed, nodding toward the horse. "I don't understand how," After what I did, Ely smiled. Really smiled, for the first time in months. Because strength isn't about never being hurt, son. It's about what you choose to do after. And that horse chose to forgive you. That's not weakness, that's grace. Later that night, Brock stood alone in the barn, gently brushing Dusty's mane under the warm glow of the overhead lamp. The Mustang leaned into his touch, calm and trusting. For the first time in his adult life, Brock closed his eyes and breathed deeply, not just of hay and wood and dust, but of something he'd never experienced before. Peace, belonging, home. From the doorway, Ely watched without speaking. Some stories don't end with fireworks or dramatic revelations. Some end with quiet understanding, with a man standing beside a horse he once broke, now helping it heal, and maybe, just maybe, healing himself in the process. In the desert silence, under stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and redemption, two broken souls and one magnificent horse proved that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not with thunder, but with the whispered promise that tomorrow can be different from yesterday. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Stories like this deserve to be told, and your support makes it possible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because we all deserve a second chance at becoming who we're meant to be.